Good evening, everyone. I was told that it's always better with the audio, so I'll try it again. Thank you for your patience. That was 30 minutes of great silence. Since we are going to contemplate the life of Saint Benedict, I thought 30 minutes of silence would be a good introduction, since it is such a Benedictine virtue, value, this silence. So Saint Benedict, 547. To start directly with a quote from Pius XII, which writing I recommend, of course, the encyclical he wrote about Saint Benedict right after the destruction of the monastery in Italy after the bombing of the place during World War II. So he wrote in 1947. Here is what he says. Like a star in the darkness of night, Benedict of Nursia brilliantly shines, a glory not only to Italy, but of the whole Church. Whoever considers his celebrated life and duties in the light of the truth of history, the gloomy and stormy times in which he lived, will without doubt realize the truth of the divine promise, which Christ made to the apostles and to the society he founded. I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world. Pius XII. And I can tell you right away how incredible it is when we read these texts, incredible to see the connection between his time, and again, keep that in mind as we go through his life, his time, the historical background, and the times we are living right now. So a beacon of hope, Saint Benedict, a light that shines in the dark of the night. What do we know from Saint Benedict? Not much, in the sense that the only writings that we have about him were written, historians do not agree on that, but were written about 30 to 50 years after his death. So in 592, pretty much. That's kind of a general date that we give. And this biography was written by Pope Gregory the Great in his famous dialogues. That's the book number 2 of his dialogues, St. Gregory the Great. But before that, we don't have anything about, none of his disciples wrote about his life. And of course, we have the rule of St. Benedict himself that we'll explain, which gives us certainly an insight of his life, his charism, his spirituality, but is certainly not a strict biography. Interesting enough, we have 16 different popes that have chosen his name. That's a clear sign that they do not only put themselves, their person, under the patronage of the saint, but their whole pontificate and the society at large is taken with them under the patronage of Saint Benedict. So extremely powerful, widely spread influence of the saint. Fundamental influence on civilization and culture in the West. Once again, if we look at these popes that have taken his name, 16 of them, and he was named by Pope Paul VI, patron saint of Europe, as you know, in more recent times. So what do we know about him, Saint Benedict? We know that he was from a noble family because he studied in Rome very early on. At the age of 7, I think, he left his family to go and study in Rome. His mother was from a noble family. His father was a general of a Roman army, captain general, that's how they would call this position back at his time, from Nursia, central Italy, not far from Rome. So noble family. His sister, remember Saint Scholastica, who was canonized as Saint Benedict. Benedict rises like a beacon of hope, a beacon in the world and in a world in distress with the fall of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire of the West falling, gigantic crisis at that time. And yet, there is certainly a paradox in the life of this saint. Very few sources, as we said, just Gregory the Great. The Rule of St. Benedict, only 73 chapters. In other words, you can read the whole thing in just about one evening. The Rule, or the book 2 of the Dialogues from St. Gregory the Great, in one night you're done with these books. So very short, and yet extremely wide influence, extremely powerful influence over not only the church but over civilization itself in the West. And also despite this terrible crisis that was dividing the West at that time, as we will see further on. So a giant, truly a giant, a beacon for the history of civilization and culture in the West, and for the blossoming of monasticism, this foundation of monasteries all over Europe. Interesting enough that some historians have even questioned his very existence because of the fact that we had so few writings about his life. Some thought, the rule is probably made up by different monks, taken from especially the rule of Saint Pachomius, who was an early father of the desert, who wrote this rule for the monks who would give themselves entirely to God in following the call and leaving the world, the cities, and going in the deserts. So we have this first rule, very primitive, very strict, lots of disciplinary rules. And so some see that as kind of a foundation for the rule of Saint Benedict. Of course, Saint Benedict was certainly influenced by that, but we cannot deny the existence of this saint simply because the sources are few. We also hear that Benedict is a founder, but if we look carefully, he hasn't founded anything. He's not a founder, but certainly a reformer. A reformer in the sense that, as I said, he gathered all the writings, all the teachings of that time and the early centuries, and of course all the teachings of St. Paul and our Lord himself, and summed them up in one teaching, his own rule. And that's why we also see that there is truly something divine in that life of this Saint Benedict, this monk, because of the influence, because of the impact of his rule in itself, so simple, so small, but the impact over the world and over centuries now. What is the historical background in which Saint Benedict grew up and became a monk and gave his life to the church? So we mentioned the fall of the Roman Empire. I have a quote here. The result was that it could be said of Roman society, it is dying and it laughs. In nearly every part of the world, tears follow on our laughter. Once again, keep in mind the analogy, the connection that I gave at the beginning between his time and our times. It is dying and it laughs. How many of our contemporaries are, despite what is going on around us, kind of keep laughing, keep enjoying what the world tries to offer us. And in nearly every part of the world, tears follow on our laughter. The world was overturned by the tremendous crisis of values and institutions caused by the collapse of the Roman Empire, the invasion of new peoples, and the decay of morals. So massive political instability at that time. Justinian is marching on with his armies to conquer the West. Remember that he was the empire for the East, and the West is falling. Therefore, he sees an opportunity to take over Italy and to take over then the Gauls and keep going up north. And on the other side, we have Totila as well, king of the Ostrogoths, trying to conquer Italy as well from the north, from Germany, what is known today as Germany mostly. This Ostrogoth, which first of all were extremely violent because still very barbarian tribes, not yet conquered by the cross of Christ. These barbarians, they were also spreading the certain heresies such as Arianism. So they had received the gospel, some of them, and had spread heresies in believing that Christ was not true God, not the sole begotten Son of God, but simply a prophet, or almost like a superman, but certainly not God himself. You see, of course, the heresy, and you see how then these heresies spreading, how divided Rome then was as well. Rome torn between these Ostrogoth on one side and the other side Justinian and the Eastern armies. Rome suffers a form of schism because of the deep-rooted divisions between prelates and cardinals. I'm well aware that there was no cardinals at that time, but it's just to help me, or we wouldn't call them, as we call them today, cardinals, but there was these very influential figures in the church, on trying to decide on who should be the next pope. So great divisions in Rome. I think to me it kind of rings a bell as well for what we see today, certainly. These cardinals, at that time Rome was divided into 7 parts, and each part being governed in some ways under the authority of a deacon. That's the original cardinals, as we would call them today. So even some of them in these Roman times, some saw in these moments, in these times, the end of the world. So nothing new on earth. We know that at the time of the apostles and the first centuries of the church, some thought that the end of the world was going to be in the year 1000. Some thought that it was right after the death of our Lord. And some at that time, St. Benedict, thought that the end of the world was near as well. And today, same thing. Nothing new on earth, as I said. So it's interesting, once again, the influence of St. Benedict, how to calm down all this and to remind everyone what is, the essential, reminding everyone's call to holiness and so on, as we will see later. Benedict is a student in Rome. As I said, at the age of 7, I think he's sent by his family to study in Rome for a couple years. And at that time, in these times, of course, he witnesses, he sees all that. And that's what leads him to leave Rome. That's what motivates him to leave Rome and to live a life as a monk and then as an hermit even, so without any community life. He leaves the eternal city because he rejects what's happening there. Interesting that at that time, martyrdom was not possible anymore, since the persecution had stopped a couple of decades earlier. And so there is still in the mind of many this desire to give oneself entirely to God. And that's exactly what we see in the person of Saint Benedict. He sees an opportunity in these terrible times to give himself entirely. Martyrdom not possible, he decides to leave the city, the eternal city, and to live as a hermit without, as I said, a community life. After performing his first miracle in this hermetic life, he decides to continue in this grotto to live in this grotto for 3 years in Subiaco. Of course, to go away from any he didn't want to become famous, and that would have been certainly an obstacle to his holiness, to his sanctification and mortification as a monk. So he decides after this first miracle to live an even stricter life. Remember this miracle with this lady who broke a vase and was totally desperate, not knowing what to do, and because she didn't have the money to pay back for this vase. And Saint Benedict took all the pieces together, put them together, and there was no crack visible on the vase, meaning that through his hand he had performed the miracle. So he lives as a hermit for 3 years, but close enough from others, of course, and especially from one monk, Romanus was his name, close enough to be able to receive from him the necessary food for subsistence. In the year 529, he will start a new foundation, Monte Cassino, of course with the solicitation of many at that time that saw in him truly a fatherly figure and a holy man and wanted to follow his way of life. And so he was kind of forced to start these little communities. He starts in Monte Cassino, and very quickly, very early on, many other communities start flourishing around it, about dozens of communities, just in a few years. And about this foundation, Cassino, says Pope Pius XII, as all know, was the chief dwelling place and the main theater of the Holy Patriarch's virtue and sanctity. From the summit of this mountain, while practically on all sides ignorance and the darkness of vice kept trying to overshadow and envelop everything, a new light shone, kindled by the teaching and civilization of old, and further enriched by the precepts of Christianity. It illumined the wandering peoples and nations, recalled them to truth, and directed them along the right path. Thus indeed it may be rightly asserted that the holy monastery built there was a haven and shelter of highest learning and of all the virtues, and in those very troubled times was, as it were, a pillar of the church and a bulwark of the faith. Once again, the analogy with our times. In these very troubled times, it's usually in these times that God sends a beacon, plants a beacon of hope, a light that shines in the darkness as Christ himself. So he sends his apostles, he sends his disciples to shine in these terrible times. So we can only pray and hope for that, and we can certainly see already the presence of some of them. Think of our dear Cardinal Burke, who is truly a beacon, a light that shines despite the terrible troubled times, as a pillar of the church. Saint Benedict. Interesting, Saint Benedict did not found really an order. As I said, he's not a founder, he's a reformer. He was born in these terrible times, very, lots of deprivation, dissolution, and he starts his little communities, but just taking what already existing at that time and rekindle in them the fire for the love of God. So he did not start really an order as such as we understand it today. He founded communities as they come, but very distinct from our modern notion of order, or even distinct from the order of St. Francis of Assisi, which had, as you know, a papal approbation, validation of the constitutions, and so on. Nothing like that for St. Benedict, but simply he welcomes men as they come, souls as they come, as they are entrusted to him, form them, and little by little, this example, this way of life shines around and attracts naturally, because again, participating in that one goodness of God, and good is diffusive of itself. On this foundation, again, another quote from Pope Gregory on the rule. He wrote, the rule of St. Benedict, he wrote a rule for his monks, both excellent for discretion and also eloquent for its style. If any be curious to know further of his life and conversation, he may understand all his manner of life and discipline in the institution of that rule, for the holy man could not otherwise teach than he himself had lived. Beautiful. So his rule is simply kind of a mirror of his own life, that he saw in himself the benefits of all that he learned, all that he practiced, and wants to share that with others. And because all that he was deeply rooted in the love of God and truly an instrument in God's hands, then he didn't have to come up with anything extraordinary, but simply, again, be a mirror of God's life that would attract others and become a beacon not only for spiritual life, but also a beacon for civilization, as we know. The genius and beauty of his teaching and truly universal, widespread discipline. Of course, they are if you look at the rule, they are very practical advices, how they are to sleep, the monks, on the sick, the measure of food, on the measure of drink. These are the chapters. On the divine office, all these chapters are, at first rules truly for monks, but because of the spirit that truly is over present in this writing, the Spirit of God, then this can be applied to any type of life, any vocation. And this is why, again, in the Institute, we are not Benedictine monks, and yet we have Saint Benedict as our patron saint. So the genius of his teaching, universal, because he truly penetrated not only the spiritual life, the understanding of God as much as one can understand God, but also the understanding of human psychology, human temperaments. When we read the rule of Saint Benedict, we see, or we look at all the miracles that he has performed. It's incredible to see how many different aspects of the society are being touched by his presence, by his miracles. Of course, the monks themselves that were around it, but also, random people, noble people, very simple people. So the whole scope, really, of the society is affected by his influence. Incredible balance between contemplation and action, prayer and hospitality. Great spirit, great intelligence, wisdom, understanding, truly were the virtues that helped him discern profoundly and analyze profoundly human behaviors and spirituality. He truly is an incarnate man in the sense that he takes both and never separates the two, the human body, human psychology, our human nature, fallen nature, and yet tries to elevate it and brings the soul as close as possible to God. So this truly a man really incarnate, as we said, and not simply a pure, spiritual, disconnected soul. He embraces the whole social, human, and spiritual reality that surrounds him. Very practical, very down to earth. If you look at the rule again, it's very extremely practical, extremely down to earth. The corrections, how to excommunicate it are to make satisfaction. On the daily manual labor, on the reception of guests, all these things, very practical, and yet the influence remains incredible for civilization, because again, all divine. So a very large sociology in some ways. The society at large is touched by all his writing. People from all kind of backgrounds, as I said. And this is extremely well described also by Pope Gregory the Great when you read his dialogue. You can see the humanity really of this saint, because sometimes it's a temptation for us to look at a saint and think, it's great, it's an example, it's very good for my edification, but I cannot really relate to this saint. But no, when you look at Saint Benedict, when you read it, it's incredible. It's very almost palpable. You can reach Saint Benedict in a very deep way, in a very simple way, in all the realities that surround us, in all different backgrounds, different vocations. A mother in education with her children can learn a lot from Saint Benedict. A monk, after 50 years of life in a monastery, can learn a lot, of course, always from Saint Benedict, and so on. A father, in the way he wants to grow in holiness, can refer to the rule and find the substantial fruit for his spiritual life. We know that he performed about 30 miracles. That gives us also, as I said, an idea of how, on the social level, how many different aspects of the society were touched by his charism and his miracles, of course. Just look at the text from St. Gregory the Great, look at all the miracles, and that gives you a good scope, of all the people that were touched by St. Benedict. The miracle is one thing, but of course there is always behind every miracle there is a teaching proper for each individual, each section of the society. So again, every aspect of human life, society, are affected by the influence of the spirit of the rule. Of course, the rule itself, if you look at the chapter like that, you will think, well, this is not meant to be for me. But no, we have to penetrate the spirit of the rule. And you can find extremely beneficial commentaries on the rule, of course. Just read Don Guéranger, Don Marmion, all these monks from the 19th century that wrote about in the spirit of Saint Benedict and wrote to all kind of people. And St. Francis de Sales, I will mention that at the end, and that will certainly be the topic of my next talk, how to connect Saint Benedict and St. Francis de Sales, since we have these two as patron saints in the Institute. the spirit of the rule here, another quote from Pius XII. During a dark and turbulent age, when agriculture, honorable craft, the study of the fine arts, profane and divine, were little esteemed and shamefully neglected by nearly all, there arose, in Benedictine monasteries, an almost countless multitude of farmers, craftsmen, and learned people, who did their utmost to conserve the memorials of ancient learning and brought back nations both old and new, often at war with each other, to peace, harmony, and earnest work. From Renaissance barbarism, from destruction and ruin, they happily led them back to benign influence, human and Christian, to patient labor, to the light of truth, to a civilization renewed in wisdom and charity. It can be asserted that the Benedictine Institute and its flourishing monasteries were raised up not without divine guidance and assistance, in order that, while the Roman Empire was tottering and barbarous tribes, goaded by warlike fury, were attacking on all sides, Christian civilization might make good its losses, and after civilizing nations by the truth and charity of the gospel. Again, we find the Institute motto here, living the truth in charity, and the connection, the points of convergence or focal points between St. Francis and St. Benedict here are very clear. Truth and charity, as the Pope mentions. So, after civilizing nations by the truth and charity of the gospel, would lead them skillfully and tirelessly to fraternal harmony, fruitful labor, to a virtuous life, ruled by the precepts of our Redeemer and guided by His grace. Ora et labora, work and prayer, which should affect all aspects of our human life and therefore all social spheres and categories, as we see still today how we can apply once again the rule of Saint Benedict. And another quote here on labora by the 12th again, it is that human labor is not without dignity, is not a distasteful and burdensome thing, but rather something to be esteemed and honored and a joy. A busy life, whether employed in the fields, in the profitable trades, or in the liberal arts, does not demean the mind, but elevates it, does not reduce it to slavery, but more truly gives it a certain mastery and power of direction over even the most difficult circumstances. That's good for us to read these words of Pope Pius XII when we kind of maybe drag our feet going to work or embracing our duties according to our different vocations. Well, here we are. Here we see how this can truly elevate. It is not a question of slavery. More truly gives it a certain mastery and power of direction over even the most difficult circumstances. It elevates the mind. But in everything, and that's kind of his motto as well, soli Deo placere desiderans, to wish to please only God. That's something we should certainly have on our desk, written, engraved on our heart as well. Soli Deo placere desiderans. Ora, now, for the prayer, the importance of prayer with Saint Benedict. First, he has to listen, and this is the prologue of his rule. Listen carefully, my child, to your master's precepts, and incline the ear of your heart. Proverbs chapter 4. Receive willingly and carry out effectively your loving father's advice, that by the labor of obedience you may return to him from whom you had departed by the sloth of disobedience. To you therefore my words are now addressed, whoever you may be, who are renouncing your own will, to do battle under the Lord Christ, the true King, and are taking up the strong, bright weapons of obedience. And first of all, whatever good work you begin to do, beg of him, with most earnest prayer, to perfect it, that he who has now deigned to count us among his children may not at any time be grieved by our evil deeds. For we must always so serve him with the good things he has given us, that he will never, as an angry father, hear it, his children, nor even as a dread Lord provoked by our evil actions, deliver us to everlasting punishment as wicked servants who would not follow him to glory. So we see right away the first word, listen. Listen, this is the first aspect, necessary aspect of prayer life. To listen, to let oneself be filled with the presence of God, with God's word, and then act. But first let yourself be totally immersed in the word of God. And how can I listen to this word of God? Of course, through my prayers, through my conscience as well, through the advice I receive from my superiors or the writings I read. It's not like, I will hear a clear voice of God. No, God talks through intermediary means that we have at hand. Again, all the teaching of the Pope, the teaching of the saints, the Gospels, trying to go back to that as often as possible. This is how we can truly first listen, the first necessary attitude. And we see here again the connection with St. Francis de Sales, but I don't want to go too quickly here. That will be our next conference. But this attitude of a child, we mentioned that also with St. Therese, the attitude of the child, this what we call the spiritual infancy, truly being like a child before God. And what is the first attitude of a child? Well, if he wants to be able to talk, he has to listen to his parents, listen to anything that surrounds him. And same, of course, in our relationship with God, we should first listen, and then once we are totally immersed, or when we received everything we should receive, then we can expect, to talk and to be able to walk in spiritual life like a little child. Attitude, therefore, of humility, necessary humility for any spiritual growth. And that's why in the chapter 7 of his rule, he gives the 12 degrees of humility. I see that it's already late, so I'll have to skip these 12 degrees, but I invite you can easily find them online. 12 degrees of humility. Of course, it's written for monks, but you can certainly reread these and see how you can apply these. This is a very good examination of conscience too, by the way. You can just take a few of these degrees of humility, the first 3, and you can spend a couple minutes of examination of conscience just with that. So why Saint Benedict as a patron for our dear institute? First, of course, the importance of Saint Benedict for the divine office. As you know, we have in our constitution, we sing the office 3 or 4 times a day as canons. We are glad to be able to offer a little insight of this life through our daily streamings here from the headquarters in Chicago. So the divine office, really, our constitution, as I said, emphasize really the aspect of prayer life, community life, that starts with the life together at the altar. That's why we have the name canon, by the way. Canon means in Greek a rule. We follow a certain rule of life, not the rule of Saint Benedict, obviously, but our own rule, our own constitution based on, of course, the spirituality of Saint Benedict, Saint Francis de Sales, and Thomas Aquinas, but especially for the office Saint Benedict, this very monastic aspect of our life. If you visit the seminary in Florence, you will see that there is a lot of silence, time of silence, a lot of time where we sing the office together, when we have the readings during the meals, and so on. All that really very Benedictine aspect of our lives. The Opus Dei, this is truly what it is. The Opus Dei, the work of God, the work at the altar. This is if I ever asked, what is the charism of the Institute, really is to bring, I would answer that it's to bring souls to the altar. I'm sure some would smile hearing that. No, we will not have girls serving at the altar, but you certainly understand what I mean. Bring all these souls as close as possible from the Blessed Sacrament. This is from the altar that can radiate then all culture and civilization, because at the altar, in the altar, is Christ truly present. So bring all these souls. That's why we emphasize so much the beauty of the altar. Nothing is done just in a superficial way. As much as we can, everything is done for the greater glory of God, because we know that if this is truly the center of our lives, because again, Christ is truly present in the tabernacle. This is where he gives himself to us. Then if we truly believe in this and truly take care of that, and that becomes the center of our lives, then Christ can radiate in souls around in many different aspects of society, because the church gathers together all kind of backgrounds, a little bit like we were talking about the rule of Saint Benedict, but same thing. That's why Saint Benedict emphasizes so much the importance of the divine office for his monks, because he knows that this is the heart, this is the center from where then we can radiate around. You need a source always, and if the source is not the altar, is not Christ, then there is a problem. He established the 150 Psalms to be recited every week. Before that, it was every day for these monks. And of course, you can imagine that because they were recited every day, there's 150 Psalms. Pretty much, monks would just recite it in a very mechanical way, very with certainly a lot of distractions, very fast, with not much attention. So he decides to be, kind of more relaxed regarding these psalms, and he says, okay, not one day, but 1 week, but at least let's pray them well, and let's even sing them. That's really the effort of Saint Benedict. Better attention than in the psalms, in the prayer, better discipline for the monks. So as the monasteries were a beacon of culture and knowledge, well, that's also certainly what we try to do with the Institute as well, with everything that we try to share once again from the altar, but to be really a channel of culture for our society. Because of the love of the true, the beautiful, and the good, which are pillars for true Christian Catholic culture and civilization. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasizes on the importance of stability, and we try to follow that as well in the Institute, certainly. That's a very Benedictine virtue or aspect of the life of the monk, this stability. So stability in the sense that we receive the same teaching, one seminary as of now. We live this life in common. We share everything, pretty much everything in the house in which we live with our other brother priests or oblates, or even the sisters together, when they live together and share the same crosses and roses, certainly. We share the same life of prayer, so again, a certain stability, regularity in our lives. The office that I mentioned, sung 3 or 4 times a day, symbol of unity and stability. Since it is already late, I wanted to give a little explanation of the medal of Saint Benedict, but I can just give I'm skipping now to our conclusion, the medal of Saint Benedict, since this is something that everybody can carry, can wear, and to remind our love and dedication to the spirit of Saint Benedict. Above the chalice and the raven in the center, on either side of Saint Benedict, you can see that it's written Crux Sancti Patris Benedicti, the cross of the Holy Father Benedict. That's in the front of the medal. The words around the perimeter of the medal, we have Eius in obitu nuo presentia muniamur. May we at our death be fortified by his presence. The back of the medal, the initial of the cross in the center, Crux sacra sit mihi lux, the Holy Cross, be my light. And I wanted to mention this medal not only for a devotion to Saint Benedict, and it's a sacramental, it's one of the very powerful sacramental, the medal, that really expels the devil, as we will see, because it says, Non dracosit mihi dux, let not the dragon be my guide, and the Holy Cross be my light. So always with exorcisms, the cross is one of the major weapons. And since we will have the Feast of the Holy Cross soon, September 14th, I thought interesting to connect the two and to remind everyone of the importance of the Saint Benedict medal. The circles by the 4 corners of the cross, Crux Sancti Patris Benedicti, cross of the Holy Father Benedict again. The initials around the perimeter, we have That's for the back of the medal. Vade retro Satana, as we just said, truly an exorcism, we cast the devil away. Step back, Satan. Num quam suade mihi vana. Do not suggest to me thy vanities. Sunt malaque libas, ipse venema bibas. Evil are the things thou profferest. Drink thou thy own poison. And at the top of it, Pax, peace. So the importance of, once again, the St. Benedict medal. For our next conference, as I said, I would like to go through the spirituality of St. Benedict and St. Francis de Sales and connect them together as members of the Institute. I think this is a good way to understand better and connect really these two saints. There is never, in the life of the saints, never a disconnection, but we can always gather all these spirituality and make a beautiful, like St. Francis de Sales says, like a sweet honey. Although so different in temperaments, in the time of history, in backgrounds, how can one unite these two giants of spiritual life and harmonize their teachings? We can certainly give 5 points of convergence or focal points. First, the sense of discretion. Discretion in the monastic way is not like discretion, not being curious, but it means prudence, a certain prudence, the right measure, right balance, no excess, a true deep realism for both of them. The second point, focal point, would be the necessity for the soul to focus on all its efforts on God. Third, this brings the soul closer to God and His love, which will become for them both the principle, the motive of all our actions. The fourth point, the importance of obedience and fidelity to our daily tasks as the key element for one's sanctification. And the fifth point would be the profound knowledge and an understanding of human nature. We have seen a perfect example of the beautiful fruits of the union of these two spiritualities already in the life of our little Therese of the Little Flower, if you remember. I will explain that later more in depth, but we saw in the life of Saint Therese how she connects that prudence, right measure in everything, the obedience to the rule, fidelity in daily things, little things, as a key for our sanctification, with the sole motive of pleasing God. This first motor of all our actions should be the love of God. And 2 quotes to conclude here just one quote from Benedict XVI. I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world. At no time in history does this promise lose its force. It is verified in the course of all ages, flowing, as they do, under the guidance of divine providence. But when enemies assail the Christian name more fiercely, when the faithful bark of Peter is tossed about more violently, and when everything seems to be tottering with no hope of human support, it is then that Christ is present, bounceman, comforter, source of supernatural power, and raises up fresh champions to protect Catholicism, to restore it to its former vigor, and give it even greater increase under the inspiration and help of heavenly grace. So we can only hope, looking at the life of our dear Saint Benedict, we can only hope that among our Catholics today may raise up fresh champions to protect our Church for the great glory of God and the salvation of souls. Amen. Thank you for your attention.